Hello and welcome to the continuous cardiac education program from ANESTTHESIA Institute of Cardiology. Today we will discuss pressure volume loops of left ventricle. So today's point of discussions are what is pressure volume loops, how we can get it, how it helps in the monitoring, and changes in the pressure volume loops in different cardiac conditions. Pressure volume loop of LV is LV pressure plotted against LV volume at different time points in single cardiac cycle. It is independent of time. Otto Frank, a German physiologist, had given description of pressure volume loops in frog's heart at the end of 19th century, and this forms the basis of the understanding of pressure volume loops. H. Suga and Sagawa were first to apply continuous pressure volume loops and provided a detailed description of pressure volume analysis of cardiac function in cardiac contraction and pressure volume relationships. How we can get pressure volume loops? In research laboratory, a continuous measurement of LV pressure with the help of micromanometer implanted in the chamber of the LV, and LV volume we can get with sonomicrometry and a conductance catheter. In clinical practice, we can measure PCWP at the end of diastole in place of end diastolic pressure through PA catheter, and systolic blood pressure as an approximation to LV end systolic pressure through arterial pressure. And for volume from the echo, we can get LV end diastolic volume and LV end systolic volume, and with the help of automatic border detection, it is easily calculated nowadays. So in this classical example of cardiac cycle by Vickers, we have taken only LV pressure and LV volume against time, and can see different phases of cardiac cycle in systole as well as in diastole. Phase A represents LV filling. After mitral valve opens, LV fills initially with a rapid filling phase, and later on 15 to 20% of LV fill at the later part of heart by atrial kick. Phase B is isovolumic contraction time, phase C is ejection time, and phase D is isovolumic relaxation time, and cycle go on continues like this. When LV pressure and volume are plotted against each other in single chart, we get pressure volume loop like this. So in this pressure volume loop, LV pressure is on the y axis and LV volume is on the x axis. So when mitral valve opens, LV filling starts initially through rapid filling, and later on with the help of atrial kick, last 15 to 20% in normal heart, we get blood, LV get bloods from atrial contraction. After that, mitral valve closure occurs and LV starts to contract. Initial phase B is isovolumic contraction. When LV pressure exceeds aortic valve, aortic diastolic pressure, aortic valve opens, and then ejection of blood occurs, that is in phase C. After ejection of the blood, when LV pressure reduces to aortic less than the aortic pressure, aortic valve gets closed, and then follows the phase of isovolumic relaxation, that is phase D. When LV pressure reduces below LA pressure, mitral valve opens and LV starts to fill again, that is phase A. Familiarity with this graphic analysis of cardiac function and normal pressure volume loop of the left ventricle provides a basis for appreciating load insensitive index of contractility, that is end systolic pressure volume relationship, that we discuss later on. Now from this figure we can get different volumes as well as different pressures of the LV. So first is and diastolic volume. When mitral valve gets closed, the volume in the heart remaining in the heart is end diastolic volume, and when aortic valve gets closed and volume remains in the heart is end systolic volume. And the difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume is stroke volume. So whenever end diastolic volume increases or end systolic volume decreases, stroke volume increases, and whenever end diastolic volume reduces or end systolic volume increases, stroke volume gets reduced. Apart from stroke volume, we can get different pressures from this PV loop. One is when aortic valve opens, it is usually aortic diastolic pressure. When aortic valve closes, it is end systolic pressure of the LV. And C point, where maximum highest pressure, peak of the pressure is systolic blood pressure. So systolic minus diastolic, we can get pulse pressure also from this loop. When mitral valve opens, it is usually the LA pressure. So we can get different volume, different pressures as well as different volumes from these PV loops. So the important concept of PV loop is end diastolic pressure volume relationship and end systolic pressure volume relationship. End diastolic pressure volume relationship is a curvilinear curve, and end systolic pressure volume relationship is a straight line. Usually all the pressure volume loops sit between these two lines. So these two lines may get changed, but always the loop stays within the two constraint of these ESPVR and EDPVR lines. And diastolic pressure volume relationship reflects preload, ventricular compliance and lusitropic condition of the left ventricle, while ESPVR and systolic pressure volume relationship reflects the contractility of the heart. Alteration in inotropic or lusitropic state of the LV lead to predictable changes in the pressure volume loop that, when combined with the knowledge of preload and afterload, can facilitate understanding of the pharmacologic and pathophysiologic responses of the heart to different maneuvers or different pharmacological treatment. So cardiac function or cardiac output depends on the preload, afterload, contractility and heart rate. As PV loop is independent of time, we cannot get heart rate from the PV loop, but we can get important information related to preload, afterload and contractility. And first we see how changes in these parameters changes PV loop independently, and then we see their interaction with each other when one of the parameter gets altered. So first, when afterload and contractility remains constant and we increases the preload by giving volume, when preload is increases, as per the Frank-Starling law, because of the increase in the length of the fiber, stroke volume gets increased, and if preload is reduced, stroke volume gets reduced. So if we increases the preload, end diastolic volume increases and systolic volume remains the same if we don't change afterload or contractility, and stroke volume gets increased. If preload is reduced, end diastolic volume is reduced, so stroke volume is reduced. So what happens when afterload is changing and there is no change in the preload or contractility? So when afterload is increased, heart has to LV has to work harder and isovolumic contraction phase prolongs, as LV has to need higher pressure to open the aortic valve, and because of the elevated aortic diastolic pressure, so ejection begins at higher LV pressure and also stops at higher LV and systolic pressure. So as LV end systolic pressure increases, end systolic volume also gets increased. And because LV end systolic volume increases, the difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume is reduced. Therefore, stroke volume is reduced. Exactly opposite happens when afterload get reduced. As afterload is reduced, LV has to work lower to eject the blood, and because of that end systolic volume reduces, and as end systolic pressure and end systolic volume reduces, stroke volume increases. Now what happens when preload and afterload doesn't change and contractility changes? So whenever increased contractility occurs, it increases the force and contraction of the heart and empties it better at the same preload and afterload due to force velocity relationship. So end systolic volume reduces when contractility is increased, and therefore stroke volume increases. Slope of end systolic pressure volume relationships is increased and it shifts to the left side. When inotropy or contractility decreases, it shifts the end systolic pressure volume relationships to the left side and its slope is decreased, and because of that end systolic volume is reduced and end systolic volume is increased, and therefore stroke volume is reduced. So when we talk about independent changes, but in intact heart, independent changes do not occur if we change the preload, afterload and contractility also changes. So what happens when this interaction occurs between different preload, afterload and contractility? So when preload changes, what happens to the afterload if contractility remains the same? So when preload reduces, as preload is reduced, LV ejects less blood into the aorta, and because of that systolic and diastolic blood pressure is reduced. This reduced systolic and diastolic blood pressure and systolic volume is also reduced, and therefore stroke volume is increased. This increase in the stroke volume in the next cycle, it decreases the end diastolic volume. So as end diastolic volume gets decreased, its pressure and volume gets decreased in the next cycle, and therefore stroke volumes try to maintain. So what happens when preload is increasing? When preload is increasing, it increases the stroke volume, as we have seen. As stroke volume is increased, it increases the systolic and diastolic blood pressure. That increases the afterload of the LV, and this increase in the afterload causes increase in the end systolic pressure and end systolic volume, and stroke volume gets reduced. So changes in the stroke volume becomes less as compared to when preload alone changes. So whenever preload changes in the direction, either it is increased or it is reduced, stroke volume gets little if affected due to compensation by change in the afterload and also change in the contractility of the heart. What happens when afterload is reduced and contractility remains the same? As we have seen, when afterload is reduced, stroke volume increases because of decrease in the end systolic volume. When end systolic volume gets reduced, it decreases the end diastolic volume also, because decrease end systolic volume decreases the end diastolic volume. So it try to compensate the increase in the stroke volume by decreasing the end diastolic volume. When afterload is increased, As afterload is increased, end systolic pressure and end systolic volume is reduced, and because end systolic volume is reduced, stroke volume is reduced. So this is compensated by increase in the preload, and this increase in the preload, because afterload is there is a increase in the end systolic volume. When next cycle the same cardiac output happens, it increases the end diastolic volume also. So because of this, what we call preload reserve, we heart try to maintain stroke volume in the normal range. But in a failure heart, when increasing the afterload does not increase the preload, because of the as heart is in the steep part of the end diastolic pressure volume relationship, stroke volume gets reduced markedly. So what happens if inotropy changes? If inotropy, like in we have seen that if contractility is increased, stroke volume gets increased. But as we have seen, as stroke volume is increased, and in the next cycle, because of the increased stroke volume, it increases the systolic and diastolic blood pressure, so it increases the afterload, and this increase in the afterload reduces the stroke volume. So heart try to maintain same stroke volume around the change in the inotropy, or change in the preload, or change in the afterload. What happens in patient with systolic dysfunction? In patient with systolic dysfunction, as there is a reduction of the there is a shift in the ESPVR curve to the right and downward, and systolic pressure and systolic volume gets, end systolic volume gets increased, and as end systolic volume is increased, they try to maintain stroke volume, and diastolic pressure also, and diastolic volume also gets increased. But as in patient with systolic dysfunction, usually they have combined systolic as well as diastolic dysfunction. Patients are on the steep part of the end diastolic pressure volume relationship. Because patient is on the steep part of end diastolic pressure volume relationship, preload reserve is not significant. So usually in these patients, stroke volume gets reduced, and heart tries to maintain cardiac output because of, with the help of increase in the heart rate. What happened in patient with diastolic dysfunction? Isolated diastolic dysfunction. Patient in isolated diastolic dysfunction, patients are on the steep part of the end diastolic pressure volume relationship, and end diastolic pressure volume relationship gets rightward and upward shifted, so that at the same end diastolic volume, end diastolic pressure is increased, and because of that, stroke volume gets reduced in patient with diastolic dysfunction. If you give lucitropic drugs, that increases the cardiac output or stroke volume of these type of patients. Now come to cardiac conditions. What happens in patient with mitral stenosis? As there is a restriction of blood flow from LA to LV in case of mitral stenosis, LV gets less blood, so left ventricle end diastolic volume is reduced, and so stroke volume gets reduced. As in mitral stenosis, LV is not affected much, only LV preload is reduced, so stroke volume is reduced in case of mitral stenosis. What happens in mitral regurgitation? In mitral regurgitation, as mitral valve is incompetent, LV ejects blood into aorta as well as into the LA, and there is no true isovolumic contraction period, as LV ejects into the low pressure LA, so afterload of LV is reduces, that decreases end systolic volume, and isovolumic relaxation time is also shortened, as large LA volume try to raises the gradient across the mitral valve and it reduces the isovolemic relaxation time. So high blood flows during diastole from LA to LV, and therefore LV end diastolic volume also increases. This increase in end diastolic volume and decrease in end systolic volume increases the stroke volume significantly. But apparently, though stroke volume is increased, true stroke volume, that LV that ejects blood into the aorta is reduced, because most of the stroke most of the part of the stroke volume goes into the LA instead of aorta. What happens in aortic stenosis? As in aortic stenosis, LV emptying is impaired due to reduced aortic wall area. So LV systolic pressure increases markedly, that causes increased LV wall stress and increase end systolic volume and end systolic pressure. So stroke volume is reduced. This increased end systolic volume increases end diastolic volume, and by Frank-Starling law increases the force of contraction and therefore maintains stroke volume at higher preload or higher ADV. But this compensation is limited by left ventricular hypertrophy in case of aortic stenosis. LV compliance is also reduced, and this put LV on the steeper part of EDPVR curve, and further increase in the gradient or afterload, either due to hypertension or reduction in the aortic wall area, may cause significant decrease in the stroke volume. What happens in aortic regurgitation? As aortic wall is incompetent, there is no true isovolemic relaxation time, and during diastole LV gets blood from LA as well as from aorta. So and diastolic volume increases significantly. So by Frank-Starling law, force of contraction also increases due to LV dilatation and raised systolic blood pressure. Afterload increases slightly in normal LV. So end systolic volume is raised slightly, and though overall stroke volume is increased significantly. But in patient with LV dysfunction, end systolic volume increases markedly because of increase in the as patient have a eccentric hypertrophy and increased wall stress. Because of that, their patient may have a higher afterload as compared to in patient with normal LV. Okay, thank you.